Welcome back to the deep dive. We're pushing forward with our look into the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure, the MPP, the essential guide for how patent claims get evaluated.
Right, we're breaking it down section by section, and today we're tackling a really key piece of Chapter 2100, patentability.
Chapter 2100 is, well, it's fundamental, setting out those core legal tests examiners use.
Absolutely. And within that, we're focusing on Section 2185. It deals with some pretty complex, intertwined issues involving claim interpretation and functional language under 35 U.S.C. 112.
Yeah, the full title is Section 2185, Related Issues under 35 U.S.C. 112A or B, and Pre-AIA 35 U.S.C. 112, first or second paragraphs. Quite a mouthful.
It is, but it's important stuff.
So our mission really is to unpack how claim interpretation itself can flag uncertainties, especially with functional claims, and how that can lead straight to rejections. It hammers home that need for precision.
Definitely. Let's start right there with claim interpretation. When an examiner looks at a claim, their first job is to figure out, what are the boundaries? What exactly is this invention?
And if they can't tell, if reading the claim leaves them unsure about what the inventor actually considers their invention.
Well, that's a big red flag, because if the examiner's not sure, how can the public know what's protected and what's not?
Right, it fails that basic notice function of a patent claim.
Exactly. And that lack of clarity, that sort of fuzziness about the scope, that's what sets you up for a rejection under 35 U.S.C. 112B for lack of definiteness.
Or under the older rules, the pre-AIA 112 second paragraph, same idea.
Same core problem. The claim isn't clearly defining the invention's edges, it's just not doing its fundamental job.
So the takeaway here is pretty stark. Precision is everything. Vague claims, indefinite claims, they're just not going to fly.
And this gets, let's say, extra tricky when we wade into functional claiming, using things like means plus function or step plus function language.
Yeah, like saying means for doing X or steps for achieving Y.
Precisely. Phrases like means for receiving a signal or step for processing data.
Now, the law actually allows this, right? Under 35 U.S.C. 112, or the old pre-AIA 112 sixth paragraph. It lets you define something by what it does.
It does allow it, yes. Which seems convenient, flexible even, but using that format doesn't let you off the hook for other rules.
Okay, so it's not a free pass.
Not at all. You still absolutely have to meet the requirements for written description, for enablement, and for definiteness.
So what's the catch? What's the condition?
The condition is crystal clear. If you claim a means for performing some function, you must also disclose the corresponding structure or the material or the acts that actually perform that function. And it has to be in your specification, your written description.
Okay. So if I claim means for transmitting data, I can't just stop there.
Nope.
My written description has to spell out how that transmission happens.
Exactly. It needs to describe the actual structure. Is it, I don't know, an RF circuit, an infrared LED setup, maybe specific software steps acting on a processor, whatever actually does the job.
Can drawings help with that?
Oh, definitely. Drawings can certainly provide part of that necessary written description of the structure.
And how much detail is enough? Who judges that?
It's judged from the viewpoint of someone skilled in that particular field, the physita.
The person having ordinary skill in the art.
Right. Would that person read your specification and understand what structure or material or acts you're talking about?
Yeah.
And crucially, for definiteness under 112B, the description needs to clearly link or associate that structure back to the function you claimed.
The connection needs to be explicit.
Explicit, not just hinted at or assumed. The link has to be there.
Okay, now, here's a potential trap I think I see. Can you just point to something everybody knows, or maybe something in another patent you reference? Say, see reference X for how to transmit data.
That's a critical point. Section 2185 flags, no, you can't do that. The corresponding structure, material, or acts must be disclosed within the four corners of your patent application's specification.
So just incorporating by reference isn't enough. Or pointing to prior art.
Not for providing the sole support for that functional element, no. Some court cases, like pressure prods and Atmel-Core, really drove this point home. The disclosure needs to be in your document.
Okay, so let's say you slip up. You use functional language, maybe means for processing, but you don't adequately disclose the corresponding structure in your spec. What happens next? What kind of rejections are coming?
Well, this is where things can start to unravel pretty quickly. You could face several types of rejections based on Section 112.
Like what?
First, potentially an enablement rejection under 112A. The argument is, because you haven't shown the structure, someone skilled in the art wouldn't actually know how to make or use your invention without having to guess or do unreasonable amounts of experimentation.
So even if I described the function well, if I haven't shown how to build the thing that does it,
It might not be considered enabled. Now, the MP key does mention a nuance. If you used, say, functional block diagrams for an apparatus, it might still pass enablement if the missing bits are really standard, conventional things well understood in the field.
but that sounds like an exception, not the rule.
Generally, yes. Especially for anything non-trivial, you need that structural support for enablement when using functional language.
Okay, what else? What's another rejection type?
You could also face a written description rejection, also under 112A. This one's about possession. Does your application, as filed, demonstrate that you actually had the complete invention at that time?
And if you didn't describe the structure for your means for,
Then the argument is maybe you hadn't fully figured out and implement that function yet, so you didn't truly possess the claimed invention when you filed.
I hear this comes up a lot with software patents.
Oh, absolutely critical there. If your claim involves, say, means for calculating a value, you generally need to describe the computer hardware involved and the specific algorithm, the steps that perform that calculation. Just saying a processor calculates it often isn't enough. You need to show the how, the algorithm.
Without the algorithm, you haven't shown possession of that functional element.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the third potential rejection.
Definiteness again, under 112B.
Right. This is maybe the most direct hit. If the structure backing up the function isn't disclosed, the claim's boundaries become inherently unclear. How broad is means for processing? What specific structures does it cover? Without that link to structure in the spec, it's just too vague.
And there's case law on this.
Yeah, cases like U.S.C. Systems and in Pre-AIA really underscore this, especially for software claims. A lack of disclosed structure or algorithm linked to a functional claim element can make the claim indefinite and therefore invalid.
Wow. Okay, so failing on the structure for functional language can lead to enablement, written description, and indefiniteness rejections, all under Section 112. That's quite the minefield.
It really is. But wait, there's more.
Oh, it doesn't stop there.
Nope. This failure also has a huge impact on how your claim is examined against the prior art.
Under Sections 102 and 103, anticipation and obviousness.
Exactly. Section 2185 points out that functional claim language, including these means plus function claims, still has to be compared to the prior art.
Okay, makes sense. But how does the lack of disclosed structure affect that comparison?
This is where it gets, well, counterintuitive for some applicants.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't disclose the corresponding structure for your functional element in your specification,
Yeah.
then for the purpose of prior art analysis under 102 and 103, the law says that any structure in the prior art that can perform the claimed function is considered an equivalent.
Whoa, wait. Say that again. Any structure.
Any structure. So going back to your means for transmitting data example,
Yeah.
if your patent didn't specify how maybe you were thinking Wi-Fi, but you didn't write it down then when the examiner looks for prior art.
They can use anything that transmits data, like old AM radio circuits, infrared signals, smoke signals, if it performs the function.
Theoretically, yes. If it performs the recited function, it can be considered an equivalent structure for the purpose of that prior art rejection. The scope of your claim for prior art purposes becomes incredibly broad.
Man, that completely flips it. You use functional language, maybe hoping for broader scope, but failing to provide structure makes you vulnerable to a much wider range of prior art.
Precisely. It dramatically increases the chances of finding anticipating or obviousness rendering prior art because the examiner isn't limited to the structure you might have intended. They can look at any structure that does the job described by your function.
So the lack of structure bites you under 112 for validity, and it bites you under 102, 103 for patentability over prior art.
It's a critical linkage. You need that structure, not just to define your invention properly under 112, but also to appropriately limit its scope when comparing it against what came before under 102 and 103.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. We started with claim interpretation needing clarity, leading to the definiteness requirement. Then we saw how functional claiming, while allowed by 112F, demands corresponding structure in the spec.
Right. And failing that structural disclosure opens the door to enablement rejections, written description rejections, and indefiniteness rejections, all under Section 112.
And the kicker, that same failure blows the doors wide open for prior art analysis under 102 and 103, making rejections much more likely because any old way of performing the function can be cited against you.
It really highlights that tension. Functional claiming gives you a way to describe the what, but the law demands you also sufficiently teach the how through structural disclosure.
So, here's something for you, the listener, to chew on. If you're drafting claims, especially in areas like software where functions are central, how do you manage this? How do you provide enough structure to satisfy 112 and limit prior art scope without giving up too much claim breadth? Where's that sweet spot between describing what it does and how it does it, especially considering enforceability down the line?
It's a constant balancing act in patent drafting, a really fundamental challenge this section brings into focus.
Definitely food for thought. Before we sign off, we want to give our sincere thanks to Mike Shepard, the creative director who makes this all happen behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you, Mike. And just a necessary word about the sources and nature of this discussion.
Right. Disclaimer. This summary of the MPEP was generated using AI tools, including ChatGPT and NotebookLM, and may contain errors or omissions. It's provided for general educational and informational purposes only. It is definitely not legal advice or a substitute for formal instruction.
For the official word, always consult the actual MPEP itself, talk to a qualified instructor, or, of course, a registered patent practitioner.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this deep dive.
Stay tuned as we continue dissecting Chapter 2100 and exploring the ins and outs of patentability under U.S. law in our next segment.